This is a stunt that's performed on a routine basis in any number of venues. Owen was simply to descend into the ring in superhero-like fashion.
Vince sentenced, not by a single judge, not in one courtroom, not with a gavel coming down and a number read aloud to a crowded gallery, but by a decade of choices that told the world exactly what kind of man he was and exactly what the company he built was really about underneath all the noise and the spectacle. The 1990s made Vince McMahon the most powerful figure in professional wrestling history. Some people call that achievement a success story, and looking at the business numbers alone, it is difficult to argue otherwise. The scale of what he constructed was genuinely remarkable. If you believe stories like this one deserve to be heard, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. This one matters. The World Wrestling Federation began the decade as a dominant but still regionally limited entertainment product. It ended the decade as a publicly traded global corporation broadcasting to audiences in dozens of countries. The cultural reach changed. The revenue changed. Professional wrestling crossed over into mainstream entertainment in ways the industry had never achieved before. The results were real, the transformation was real, and the ambition that drove all of it was absolutely real. But results have a price. Behind every championship belt, behind every sold-out arena night, behind every record pay-per-view number, there was a price being paid. Not by Vince McMahon, by the people who made all of it possible, the men and women who gave their bodies to his product week after week, year after year, often through serious pain and physical damage that would end careers in any other sport. Dirty, the people who traveled hundreds of nights a year to put on shows that made his company rich, covering every one of their own costs while they did it. Families who needed real answers about what happened to people they loved and waited years to receive anything that approached the truth. The cost of the 1990s was never measured in corporate revenue. It was measured in broken bodies, stripped dignity, families left without fathers, and lives that ended far too early. The story of the 1990s, WWF, is often told as a story of reinvention. The company went through several identities across that decade. It faced legal siege in the early years. It stumbled through an awkward middle period. It roared back with the Attitude Era and demolished the competition. Each phase of that story has been written about extensively and enthusiastically, each celebrated as chapters in an improbable comeback. What gets written about less is the structure underneath every phase, the system that stayed constant regardless of what the product looked like on screen, the workers who carried that product without the protections they deserved, the decisions made quietly, behind boardroom doors and in contract language that determined what the decade cost and who ended up paying for it. How did one decade turn Vince McMahon into the most powerful man in wrestling? And why did so many people pay the price for what he built? That is what this story's about. Let us find out together. Now, let us start at the night that defines the whole decade, the night that stripped away every layer of entertainment and showed exactly what was underneath, the night that simply cannot be so easily explained away. Hot May 23rd, 1999, Kansas City, Missouri. The over-the-edge pay-per-view was in full swing. The arena was packed and loud. Fans had paid good money to be there in person or to order the broadcast at home. The card was strong. The atmosphere was what you want from a major pay-per-view crowd. Energetic, engaged, fully present in the show. Wrestlers had been performing all night without incident. The broadcast was running to schedule. Nothing in the air suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Owen Hart was preparing to make his entrance for a match. He was performing under the character called the Blue Blazer, a comedic superhero persona, intentionally over the top, designed to get a laugh and build energy before the in-ring action began. Owen was one of the most gifted technical wrestlers of his entire generation. He was beloved by the performers who worked with him and by fans who had watched his career develop. He was funny backstage. He was devoted to his family. He had 2 young children and a wife waiting for him at home. He had been in wrestling his whole adult life, following in the footsteps of his father Stu Hart and his brothers, all of whom had given their lives to the business. The plan for his entrance that night was theatrical. He was to be lowered from the arena rafters above the ring, descending dramatically with the crowd watching. It had been used before. It looked impressive on camera. Everyone involved moved forward with the preparation, and the show went on around it. What nobody watching in that arena knew was that the equipment holding Owen Hart was catastrophically wrong for what it was being asked to do. And the clip used in his harness was a snap-shackled device, a marine component, the kind of hardware you find on a yacht or a sailboat, built specifically for quick release under light loads in a water environment. This clip was engineered engineered to release under approximately 6 pounds of pressure. Owen Hart weighed around 250 pounds. There is no version of that calculation that ends safely. The clip released far too early. Owen fell approximately 78 feet from the rafters to the ring canvas below. He was taken immediately to a nearby hospital. He did not survive. What happened after he was pronounced dead is something that wrestlers, fans, journalists, and the Hart family have discussed with grief and anger for more than 2 decades. The people in charge of the event made an executive decision, wherein the show would continue. It was paused for approximately 15 minutes. Wrestlers backstage were gathered and told what had happened to Owen. They were given the option to perform the rest of the night or to step away. Every account from the people who were in that locker room describes the same atmosphere: numbness, shock, the kind of silence that settles in when something has happened that nobody has a script for. Some wrestlers went out and performed their matches. Some could not bring themselves to do it. The broadcast resumed regardless. The event ran to its conclusion. Jim Ross was calling the show on commentary. He had to be the voice that told the home audience what had happened. He said in interviews years afterward that it was the hardest thing he ever did in his professional life. There is nothing in a broadcaster's career that prepares you for that moment. Nothing that gets you ready to tell thousands of paying viewers that a man they had just been watching has died. He did it because someone had to. And the fact that he had to do it at all while the event continued running around him, while the show went on, tells you plainly where the priorities were in that building that night. Vince McMahon later described the decision to keep going as a gutsy call. He said that knowing Owen would have wanted the show to go on. The Hart family did not accept that framing. Many wrestlers who were present that night did not accept it. Many fans never have. What they saw was a company in which a performer had just died, in circumstances requiring immediate and serious examination. When the first response from the senior executives was to protect the pay-per-view revenue, to keep the broadcast running, to minimize the interruption to a commercial product, to manage around the death of Owen Hart rather than stop for it. Martha Hart pursued legal action. The investigations and legal filings that followed uncovered troubling information about what had led to that night. According to the submissions made by the Hart family, the WWF had deliberately bypassed qualified and experienced rigging professionals when designing and planning the stunt. Those professionals had reportedly raised concerns about the design and communicated clearly that it was unsafe. The response, according to Martha Hart's legal position, was to hire unqualified riggers who did not follow the safety protocols that the job required. No redundant safety line was ever put in place. Her position was consistent and specific. Corporate decisions, driven by cost-cutting and a desire for a particular visual effect, had directly and foreseeably led to her husband's death. The WWF directed blame at the harness manufacturer, a company called Lumar, but rather than face the full open scrutiny of a public trial, with all of the planning decisions and safety choices examined in a courtroom, the organization settled the wrongful death lawsuit in the year 2000 for a total of $18 million. Martha Hart received $10 million. Their children, Oisin and Athena Hart, each received $3 million. Owen's parents, Stu and Helen Hart, received $2 million. The Owen Hart Foundation was built with that settlement money. It has done real and lasting good work. It continues to. Martha Hart has never softened her position or accepted the company's preferred version of events. Not in the years immediately after Owen's death, and not in the decades since. Every attempt to present what happened as an unfortunate and unforeseeable accident has been met with her direct refusal to accept it. She has called it what she believes the evidence clearly shows: systemic negligence. Decisions made at a corporate level by people who had been warned, who chose to proceed, and who then settled rather than face a trial where all of that would be examined openly and on the public record. We will return to Owen at the end of this story, but to understand how the WWF arrived at that night in Kansas City, you have to understand the decade that built toward it. Because May 23, 1999 was not an isolated event. It was the final and most devastating endpoint of 10 years shaped by a specific and consistent set of priorities. To understand it fully, we have to go back to the beginning, because those 10 years nearly ended before they properly started. In the early 1990s, Vince McMahon came within a few jury deliberations of losing everything he had constructed. And the threat that nearly destroyed him did not come from a competing wrestling promotion. It came from the United States federal government. The event that triggered the crisis was the 1991 conviction of Dr. George Zahorian III. He was a urologist based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who had been working as a ringside physician for the WWF, attending events and maintaining close regular access to the performers and the corporate offices. But he was convicted of illegally distributing anabolic steroids, and the evidence that emerged from his conviction did not remain confined to Zahorian. It pointed directly at the company that had employed him. Investigators established that Zahorian had been supplying controlled substances directly to the WWF's corporate headquarters, known as Titan Towers, and to individual members of the roster. What made the damage significantly worse was a document that emerged from inside the organization itself. A memo from 1989 written by Linda McMahon, who was the CEO of the WWF at the time. That memo showed clearly that the executive leadership of the company had been aware of serious suspicions about Zahorian years before any federal investigation began. The document reportedly recommended that Zahorian no longer be used at WWF events, citing those specific concerns about steroid distribution. But nothing changed. He continued attending shows. He kept his access to the performers and to the building. The warning was written, it was seen, and it was disregarded. By 1993, Zachary W. Carter, the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, had built what he believed was a strong and prosecutable case. Vince McMahon was indicted on 6 separate charges: conspiring to distribute steroids, possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute, embezzlement of Titan Sports corporate funds to purchase illegal substances. The government's argument was not passive. The prosecution maintained that McMahon had not merely allowed steroid use to exist around him. He had created the conditions that made it functionally mandatory for performers who wanted to keep their jobs. The evidence supported the scale of what had been occurring. When Zahorian had sold drugs to 43 professional wrestlers, and 37 of those men were employed by the WWF at the time those deliveries were made. The orders were reportedly placed through McMahon's executive secretary, Emily Feinberg. The substances arrived at the corporate headquarters and were collected alongside weekly paychecks and fan mail. It was not hidden, it was not unusual, it was routine. The 1994 trial was presided over by Judge Jacob Mishler. The prosecution built its case significantly around testimony from wrestlers who had been inside the company. The most prominent name called to the witness stand was Hulk Hogan, who testified under the court-assigned designation of John H. Doe with full immunity from prosecution. Hogan confirmed that he had used steroids extensively since 1975. He confirmed that substances had come through McMahon's office, but he also stated directly that McMahon had never personally ordered him to take anything and had never personally sold him anything. That testimony gave the defense what it needed. Kevin Wachholz, who had performed under the ring name Nails, testified that McMahon had personally pressured him to increase his physical size through steroid use. Under cross-examination from defense attorney Jerry McDevitt, that testimony was systematically dismantled. McDevitt established that Wachholz had been fired from the company and had filed a civil lawsuit against them. When pressed under oath, Wachholz admitted that he hated Vince McMahon. The defense used that admission to present him as a man motivated by personal revenge rather than truthful testimony. When the government's case was severely weakened, Judge Mishler dismissed the distribution charges on jurisdictional grounds. The jury deliberated for 16 hours on the remaining conspiracy charge and returned a not guilty verdict. Vince McMahon was acquitted. The product changed immediately after the verdict. The muscle-bound performers of the 1980s were phased out. The new generation era arrived, built around technically skilled wrestlers like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. A publicized drug testing program was announced. How consistently that program was applied and enforced over the subsequent years has been questioned by critics and observers for decades. Not guilty is a legal verdict. It is not a moral clearance. McMahon took specific lessons from that trial. He learned that corporate structure matters enormously. Was that who controls information and who has legal standing to testify matters. That the way you classify workers determines your exposure. And he applied those lessons to every aspect of the company's operation for the rest of the decade. The clearest expression of that structural thinking was the way the WWF classified the people who made it successful. Every wrestler in the company was labeled an independent contractor, not an employee. That legal classification, in practical terms, meant that every financial and legal protection that employment law provides was simply removed from these workers. No employer provided health insurance, no company pension or retirement fund, no social security contributions from the WWF wrestlers paid a 15% self-employment tax on their entire income. They covered their own travel costs, their own accommodation, their own meals on the road. When they suffered injuries in the ring, and injuries ranging from minor to catastrophic were an inherent feature of this work, every medical bill was their own financial responsibility. Some of those bills were enormous. Some of those injuries ended careers without any employer support of any kind. Despite this supposedly independent status, the company maintained total operational control over these workers. They could not perform for competing promotions without explicit written approval from the WWF. They could not pursue outside entertainment or acting work without permission. Now, they had no freedom over how and where they worked. They were controlled in every practical sense, while receiving none of the protections that employment status would have legally required the company to provide. Any attempt to push back collectively had been crushed before the decade even started. In the late 1980s, Jesse Ventura had tried to organize a union among WWF performers ahead of WrestleMania 2. Reports indicate that Hulk Hogan informed McMahon about the effort. McMahon's response was immediate and decisive. Wrestlers identified as supportive of unionization were fired. A culture of fear was established in the locker room. That culture endured throughout the entire decade. The lesson was absorbed by everyone in the building. Try to organize and your career ends. The legal framework made the situation even more dangerous for anyone thinking about collective action. Independent contractors have no rights under the National Labor Relations Act, no right to organize or to demand collective bargaining, no statutory protection against retaliation. And while employees organizing for better conditions are protected by certain legal exemptions, independent contractors are not. A group of independent contractors pushing collectively for better pay could potentially be sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act for treble damages. The system did not just fail to protect these workers, it created active legal risk for anyone who tried to stand up for their rights or the rights of their colleagues. McMahon also made sure there was nowhere else to go. The old territorial system had given wrestlers a degree of protection for decades. If you had problems with one promoter, you could find work in another territory. McMahon dismantled that system in the 1980s by raiding territories for their top talent and using national television deals to drive regional promotions out of business. By the 1990s, the United States had essentially one major wrestling employer. If you were released by the WWF or found yourself blacklisted, your ability to earn a living in the profession you had spent your entire adult life building was effectively gone. A monopoly disciplines workers not only through direct action, it disciplines them through the elimination of alternatives. Think about what this meant in the daily life of a working wrestler during the 1990s. You were on the road for the vast majority of the year. The schedule during the peak of the Attitude Era was relentless. Hundreds of shows annually, international tours, one pay-per-view events, television tapings every week. You drove from city to city in rental cars, splitting the cost with other wrestlers to save money. You paid for your own hotels. You paid for your own food. You covered the flights that were not part of any company arrangement. When you got hurt in the ring, which happened with regularity in a business built on physical contact performed at high speed, you paid those bills yourself too. You had no health insurance from the employer. You had no pension waiting for you at the end of your career. You had no sick leave. You did not get paid when you were injured. You either worked through the pain or you did not get paid. Many wrestlers chose to work through injuries that would have ended careers in other professional sports because they knew that stepping away meant losing your spot and losing your spot in a monopoly market meant losing everything. The system was constructed to make non-compliance personally and financially ruinous, not through threats or direct pressure alone, but through the simple economic reality that it built around everyone inside it. That monopoly, when challenged by serious competition, was defended through the courts with the same aggression it showed in every other area. In 1996, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash chose to leave the WWF and sign with World Championship Wrestling. Hall had performed as Razor Ramon, Nash had performed as Diesel. The WWF initiated legal action immediately. The company's argument was that these characters were entirely corporate property, not belonging in any meaningful sense to the men who had built them. Court filings described the characters in precise detail. Razor Ramon was defined by a distinctive Hispanic accent, a specific hairstyle with a curl at the front, a toothpick in the mouth, chains around the neck, and a particular style of dress. Diesel was defined by a goatee and mustache, black leather trousers, a leather vest with silver studs and tassels, and a black fingerless glove. Service marks registered to the company. Hall and Nash owned none of it, the WWF argued. The lawsuit maintained that WCW was deliberately misleading fans and trading on goodwill the WWF had built around those names and presentations. The litigation continued until the year 2000 before settling as part of broader corporate restructuring. Most specific claims were dismissed before that point, but the lawsuit achieved what it was designed to achieve well in advance of any settlement. It created legal uncertainty around Hall and Nash at the most critical period of their WCW careers. It distracted and slowed the competition, and it sent every performer in the industry a message. The persona you built over years of work in that ring, the character the fans paid money to see, the company might own all of it. McMahon made that message visible on television simultaneously. In late 1996, he introduced Glenn Jacobs as a replacement Diesel and Rick Bognar as a replacement Razor Ramon. Audiences rejected both almost immediately. Those segments are still recalled as among the weakest weakest and most poorly received content of that era, but the purpose behind them was never audience entertainment. By keeping those gimmicks active on WWF programming, the company maintained its trademark claims and could argue in court that Hall and Nash were the infringers. Legal strategy executed as television content. No moment in the decade made the personal cost of McMahon's approach more naked than Montreal in November 1997. Bret Hart had been the defining figure of the WWF through the mid-1990s. He was the champion. He was the face the company used when it needed to project credibility and quality. In 1996, McMahon had signed Hart to a contract reportedly covering 20 years. An almost unprecedented long-term commitment in any entertainment industry. Hart stayed. He did not take the competing offers available to him from WCW. By 1997, the financial situation inside the WWF had changed significantly. McMahon came to Hart and told him the company could no longer honor the financial terms they had committed to. He encouraged Hart to negotiate with WCW. Hart signed a deal worth $3 million per year with the competition. The same man who had persuaded Hart to stay loyal had now encouraged him to leave. But Hart was still the reigning WWF champion, and his contract included a creative control clause active for his final 30 days with the company. At the Survivor Series in Montreal, Hart exercised that clause and refused to lose the title to Shawn Michaels. The rivalry between Hart and Michaels was genuine and deeply personal. Hart argued that losing to Michaels in Canada, in front of a crowd that treated him as a national figure, was a calculated humiliation his contract gave him grounds to refuse. He proposed alternatives. Vacating the title, losing it in the United States at a later date. McMahon rejected every proposal. The plan that was actually executed was known only to a small inner circle. During the match, Michaels applied Hart's own finishing submission hold, the sharpshooter. On a signal from McMahon to timekeeper Mark Yaton, referee Earl Hebner called for the bell and declared Hart had submitted. Hart had not submitted. He had not tapped. He had not indicated surrender in any form. The match was declared over anyway. Hart spat on McMahon at ringside. Now, the locker room confrontation that followed that night left McMahon with a black eye. And when the betrayal generated enormous public controversy, McMahon absorbed that controversy into the product. The real anger aimed at the real Vince McMahon was transformed into the Mr. McMahon television character, the villainous boss. The feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin that developed from that character drove the Attitude Era to its greatest rating successes. The betrayal of a loyal performer became the most valuable creative asset the company had ever had. The moral failure became the ratings engine, and the exploitation of real human experience as entertainment material extended well beyond what happened in Montreal. The creative philosophy of the late 1990s was called Crash TV, developed primarily by writers Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara. The approach prioritized speed, shock, and the constant use of whatever real material was available. Fiction was secondary. If reality generated stronger audience reactions, reality would be scheduled. The distinction between a storyline and a genuine human tragedy was not treated as a creative or ethical boundary. It was treated as a production resource to be used. What this meant in practice was that the line between the performance and the performer was erased whenever it suited the program. Wrestlers were not just playing characters. They were being asked, often without genuine consent and sometimes without any advanced discussion, to have their real lives folded into the entertainment product. If you had a substance problem, it went on television. If you were grieving, a camera crew appeared. If you had a family tragedy in your background, it became context for a segment. The argument made internally, or at least implied, was that this was just good television, that audiences wanted reality, that blurring the line between what was happening on screen and what was happening off it made the product more compelling. What it actually created was an environment where no one inside the business could be certain where the professional obligation ended and where the personal exploitation began. Performers learned that their real struggles, their real relationships, their real grief were not protected from the program. They were potential content, and in a company where the power dynamic was as lopsided as it was in the WWF, where the independent contractor classification meant you had almost no legal recourse and nowhere else to go. Declining to participate when asked was not genuinely an available option for most people. The result was a product that generated enormous ratings on the backs of real human suffering, and a business that felt no obligation to acknowledge the difference between the two. Women on the roster were routinely placed in content designed to objectify and humiliate rather than showcase their talent. Bra and panties matches, bikini contests. On the episode of Raw that aired on the 5th of March 2001, McMahon forced Trish Stratus to get on all fours in the center of the ring and bark like a dog. He called her derogatory names. He ordered her to strip. Sections of the crowd cheered. That was the audience culture that years of this type of content had produced. The public humiliation of women had been packaged as entertainment, and the audience had been conditioned to receive it as standard fare rather than what it actually was. Scott Hall was another performer whose real and serious struggles with alcohol were widely known throughout the industry. Content during this period that incorporated visibly intoxicated performers, presenting them stumbling through segments and matches, was treated as entertainment rather than as the serious welfare concern it represented. The business had decided that visible suffering was content. The Von Erich family of Texas had experienced devastating losses across multiple years, with several family members dying in circumstances deeply connected to the pressures and culture of professional wrestling. That family history, those deaths, those real and profound losses, were used as background and context in programming. Real tragedy packaged as dramatic backstory. Brian Pillman died in October 1997 from a heart attack. He was 35 years old. Less than 24 hours after his death, McMahon appeared via live satellite on WWF programming to conduct an interview with Pillman's widow, Melanie Pillman. The segment was promoted throughout the broadcast as a reason for viewers to keep watching. McMahon asked deeply intrusive questions about the state of their marriage and whether she had seen warning signs. He asked things that no one should ever direct at a woman in the first hours of her grief. The Wrestling Observer named it the disgusting promotional tactic of the year. It remains one of the most consistently cited ethical low points in the company's history. By the end of the decade, the WWF was a publicly traded company. The federal government had failed to convict its founder. The competitive landscape had been eliminated or absorbed. The cultural crossover had succeeded beyond what anyone in the industry had thought possible. By every conventional measure of business success, the decade belonged to Vince McMahon. But what was the foundation under all of it? A workforce stripped of every legal protection through a classification designed specifically to remove them. The systematic crushing of every collective effort workers made to demand better conditions. A competitive landscape dismantled so thoroughly that leaving the company meant leaving everything. Legal aggression that told performers their identities belonged to the corporation. Content that used real addiction, real grief, honor, and real dignity as programming material. And a safety culture that, on May 23, 1999, produced a result that no settlement and no statement could ever adequately address. The $18 million paid to the Hart family, the not guilty verdict in the steroid trial, the settled intellectual property cases. Inside the organization, these were costs of doing business. Figures in a ledger, the price of operating at scale. The machine calculated them and kept moving. Martha Hart has never let that framing stand unchallenged. Every attempt to soften what happened to Owen, to present it as an unforeseeable accident, has been met with her direct and specific refusal to accept it. The Owen Hart Foundation has done meaningful work in his name, and Martha's insistence on maintaining the full honest record and on refusing to let systemic negligence be renamed as simple tragedy is a form of accountability that no legal settlement was designed to produce and no company press release was ever going to provide. The history of the 1990s WWF is sometimes treated as a complicated legacy, a package of creative brilliance and ethical failure, too tangled to judge clearly, but the complications are not evenly distributed. The creative successes were enjoyed by a corporation and its shareholders. The ethical failures were paid for by individual human beings who had far less power than the organization they worked for and no structural protection when things went wrong. Holding those two things together honestly does not mean dismissing the entertainment value of what was created. It means insisting that the full cost of creating it be visible alongside the product. It means refusing to let the settlement figures and the legal victories be the final word. An $18 million settlement is a business transaction. It is not justice. The story of what Owen Hart's death actually represented, what it says about the priorities of the organization in which it occurred, is not contained in a settlement figure. It is contained in the decisions that were made long before May 23, 1999, in the choices about which rigging experts to listen to and which to bypass, in the culture that had been built across a decade that said when the show must go on, the show must go on, in a business model that treated everything, including human safety, as a line in a cost calculation. Each of those names represents a specific failure of the system that McMahon built. Why? And behind each of those names are many more. Wrestlers who worked themselves to the point of serious injury because stopping meant losing income they could not afford to lose. Performers whose mental health deteriorated under the pressure of a schedule that would be illegal in almost any other industry because the company could not classify them as employees. People who left the business in their 30s or 40s with no savings, no pension, no health care, and bodies that had accumulated years of damage. The short-term glamour of professional wrestling in the 1990s was real. The arenas were full, the crowds were electric, the television ratings were historic. And the people who produced all of that, it experienced the long-term consequences of doing it inside a system that had been deliberately designed to extract everything from them while returning as little as possible. The history is always darker than the highlight reel. The full truth is always worth more than the edited entertainment version. Vince sentenced. Remember it by what it cost, and by naming clearly and without revision who was always asked to pay it. Not the company, the people. The performers of that era built something extraordinary under conditions that were often deeply unfair to them. Their talent and their sacrifice and their willingness to give their bodies to a product night after night deserve to be remembered with complete respect and complete honesty. The fans who love this business deserve to know its history without the softened edges and the revised narratives. They deserve to understand what the show they loved was built on, what it required, what it took from the people at the center of it. And every person working in professional wrestling today, benefiting from whatever improvements in safety and conditions currently exist, carries the inheritance of those who came before them and were failed by a system that should have done far better by them. They were the ones who paid. This story is theirs. Like this video. Subscribe for more stories like this. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this decade hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear the full story. This conversation is absolutely worth having, and it is absolutely worth continuing, and it is worth your time.